Good evening, everyone. Hi. My name is Maarten van Essen. I'm the program director of the John Adams Institute, and it's great to see you all here at the OBA, the Openbare Bibliotheek Amsterdam, also known as the Public Library of Amsterdam. This is our second live event that we're having since the COVID-19 pandemic hit, and I'm very happy to see you all here in the flesh, the warm bodies here in the room again. With Empire of Pain, Patrick Radden Keefe has written a book about how the wealthy Sackler family produced and pushed the prescriptions of OxyContin, one of the most addictive painkillers in the opioid crisis, resulting in over 500,000 deaths in the past 20 years. The book, as well as Patrick Radden Keefe himself, will be properly introduced, of course, by tonight's moderator, Eelco Bosch van Rosenthal. But before we start off, I would like to give some warm words of thank to the publisher Nieuw Amsterdam, for working with us to bring Patrick Radden Keefe to Amsterdam for this. They did a wonderful job with the translation of the book. I forgot the name. Empire of Pain, which is translated into Dutch into Het pijnstillerimperium, which is translated by Hans van Riemsdijk. And I want to say, as my colleague Tracy, where you used to probably seeing here on stage, always says that if you do master the Dutch language, please do buy the Dutch edition of the book. It's because of publishing houses such as Nieuw Amsterdam and others here in the Netherlands that invest and take the effort to translate these books and put them out in the market here in the Netherlands, that we are able, as John Adams are able, to organize these events. And we would be very thankful if you support your local publishing houses as well, support your local booksellers. So tonight, of course, as usual, bookseller Atheneum is having a stand outside where you can buy the book and have them signed by Patrick Radden Keefe after the event. People who've been to the John Adams before know a little bit how the structure of the evening works. Eelco Bosch van Rosenthal will introduce Patrick, will say a few words about the book, and then Patrick will talk a little bit about the book, introduce the book, and then after that we'll go into a moderated discussion between Patrick Radden Keefe and Eelco Bosch van Rosenthal. After that, of course, there will be plenty of room for you to ask questions. There's one thing, we don't have a microphone here. So for this time you're allowed to shout your questions towards Patrick or Eelco maybe. Eelco will repeat the question because we have, as you see, recordings going on here, so it will be on tape. Of course, we don't have microphones here because of COVID-19 reasons, so we're not allowed to. As said, tonight's moderator is Eelco Bosch van Rosenthal. He is, next to being a board member of the John Adams Institute, he is mostly known as his work for the daily news program, TV news program, Nieuwsuur, as well as the host of several documentaries he's made, and as well as his commentary on American politics and American culture in Dutch talk shows, such as last night when he was on Khalid and Sophie, talking about het pijn. I'm going to mix up all the English and the Dutch side. Het pijnstillerimperium, Empire of Pain. For now, warm welcome for Eelco Bosch van Rosenthal.
If you think Maarten's pronunciation was bad, wait until you hear Patrick's pronunciation of pijnstillerimperium. We'll get to that later. Thank you all, warm bodies, to repeat what Maarten said, for being here. It's really nice to have everybody back in the room. Let me just say something briefly about this kind of introduction. Because when you invite a writer to an occasion like this, you want to be nice and polite, but at the same time you want to be honest. And not every book is as brilliant as the last one, just as not every moderator is as good as the last one. So there are occasions in which you introduce an author by politely saying that he wrote a very interesting book, which means that somehow you did not quite get it. Or you would say it's expertly written, which means that it's factual, true, but it's also boring. And sometimes when you refer to a book as a page turner, it simply means that you want to turn the pages as quickly as you can so you can move on and start with the next book. With our guest tonight and with his book Empire of Pain, all these word games will not be necessary because Patrick Radden Keefe did write a brilliant book in the true meaning of the word, and he did write a page turner. In my particular case, I turned the pages even faster because I was in such a rush knowing his work to order the book that I accidentally bought the large print version, which means the letters were this big and only a few sentences fitted on the page. So I turned about 1,000 pages, which is twice the size of most copies of the book. That said, Empire of Pain truly is an amazing book. First of all, because it turns the spotlight to the main culprits of the opioid epidemic. The fact that there was or there is an opioid epidemic is quite well known. There have been plenty of books and reporting on that. When I began reporting from the US, it was in the late 1990s, and that was also the time when OxyContin was approved, and we'll get to talk about that later. And the 20 years since, every time you would visit, particularly the part of the country that would later be known as Trump country, flyover country, the part of the country where politicians wouldn't visit. This is where OxyContin and other painkillers hit really hard, and you could see it all over, and it ruined many lives. But even when newspaper articles started appearing about the painkiller epidemic, and even when the name of the pharmaceutical company responsible for this drug, Purdue Pharma, would appear in these articles, the name of the Sackler family who owns the business was hardly ever mentioned. It was just not mentioned in relation to the painkiller epidemic for reasons that Patrick and I will discuss in a minute. This book lifts the curtain for good reason, and it's important that everybody reads it. It begins as a family chronicle, and if he had ended there, it still would have been a fascinating book. It would have been a book about love and hate and greed, a very New York book about philanthropy. It would be a very Trumpian book without the philanthropy. But he decided to continue his reporting, and then the story turns, and it gets to be a wild narrative and also an infuriating narrative about a company and a family that will soon poison America and ruin literally hundreds and thousands of lives. Patrick Radden Keefe is a staff writer for The New Yorker. He is the author of several books. The most recent one before this one is called Say Nothing, about the troubles in Northern Ireland. He was also the host of the podcast Wind of Change, which was a huge hit last year. I have always wondered why the Scorpions or even the song Wind of Change even existed. And our guest tonight explored that question as well. And he ended up with the CIA, and I know that there are people in the audience who want to ask questions about the podcast, and I hope we'll get to it during our conversation, and otherwise there'll be plenty of room at the end to ask those questions. But first, Empire of Pain. That is what we'll talk about most of this evening. And before we start the conversation, I want to give the floor to our guest tonight, Patrick Radden Keefe.
You know, you spend years and years working and writing articles and writing books, and you hope that someday someone will use the adjective Trumpian to describe what you do. This is a big night for me. I'd first of all like to thank the John Adams Institute, and Martin, thank you so much for having me here. I'd like to thank my publisher, Nieuw Amsterdam, for bringing me over. It's been a huge treat to be back in Amsterdam. I wrote a big piece for The New Yorker a few years ago about the Astrid Holleder case, and I spent about 10 days in Amsterdam reporting that story, and really, I'd visited the city before as a tourist, but I hadn't. I was, in this case, I was living in an apartment, and I sort of felt not that I had quite become one of you, but I felt like something other than a tourist, and I got to know the place and really adored it. And I'd like to thank Eelco for that introduction and for calling my work Trumpian. And all of you. It's a huge thrill to be in a room with people. This book came out in the US and the UK earlier this spring, and I've done a lot of these events, but they're events in which I'm staring into the beady eye of my laptop. And I'm literally sitting at the desk where I spent the previous 2 years working on the book. So the idea of being kind of alone in solitude, staring at your laptop and then publishing the book, and what you get to do is sit at your desk and stare into the laptop some more, was a little demoralizing. And it's been amazing to be out and meeting real flesh and blood readers. I'm just going to say a few words by way of introduction, and then I hope we can get into the conversation. So as Eelco mentioned, I write for the New Yorker magazine. I write narrative nonfiction. So the stories that I tell are true, but they're also very much stories, and I try and tell them as stories. I find that, from childhood, I had a tendency to be much readier to digest information if it was told to me as a story. And whether that was, growing up with my mother reading me stories in bed before I went to sleep at night, or reading a history book or a novel. If it was a story about a person making choices, a person in some milieu, in some situation, I could be drawn into the most unfamiliar territory and engage with issues that I might otherwise have no interest in engaging with. And so as a journalist, that's kind of the way that I approach the articles and the books and the podcast even. I tend not to start with an issue, but often to start with a character or a question and sort of find my way in, and usually do a great deal of research and then hopefully come back and present it as a story that can draw you in. So, the opioid crisis has been mentioned here, and this is a book where I didn't start out thinking I wanted to write about the opioid crisis. And I would think that there are probably many of you who might not necessarily think that you have an interest in that subject. But I think there's a deeper story here, and one that's really fascinating, and one that pulled me in over the last several years, and one that I hope might pull you in as well. So I'll tell you just a little bit about how I got into it. I have always been really interested in drugs, in the subject of drugs, how they fit into society, how they fit into our lives, how we think about drugs and our relationship with them. It's interesting being in Amsterdam because this is a place where, certainly growing up, it was always, the reputation of Amsterdam that there was a different approach taken to cannabis than many other places. And it's funny to think that you now see a lot of experimentation in terms of what kinds of legal regimes you would have around cannabis. It's as if the world has caught up with the Netherlands in this regard. I wrote a big piece a few years ago for the New Yorker about the legalization of cannabis in Washington State. The idea that you had this illegal economy that had existed, this underground economy that had been around for decades, and it was thriving, but it was illegal. And then with the stroke of a pen, at midnight one night, it became legal, regulated, taxed. How do you do that? What is that? How does that work? And for me, of course, it's stories, right? So what I wanted to talk to was the policy wonk who designed this thing, and the underground, street corner pot dealers, and the cannabis farmers who had been living in the underground economy, and what's it like for them overnight to suddenly become legal. I also wrote a lot about Mexican drug cartels. I wrote a big story in 2012, actually not for the New Yorker, it was before I went full-time there, but for a cover story for the New York Times Magazine about the Sinaloa drug cartel. And we think of these as these kind of murderous gangster organizations, and they certainly are that. But what I was interested in is looking at these cartels as businesses, because they're also multi-billion-dollar transnational commodities enterprises. And so I wondered, how did they do their businesses? When they sit down and they talk about how much are we going to diversify, do we want to be vertically integrated, what does that look like? How do you resolve disputes over contract? And it raised all these interesting questions. And so I wrote this piece that I thought of it, I sort of joked at the time that it was like a Harvard Business School case study of a Mexican drug cartel. And one of the things I noticed is that the Sinaloa cartel had multiple different product lines, and they were exquisitely sensitive to customer demand. So they would know when people in Chicago wanted a little more meth than they did the month before, or a little less cocaine. And in around 2010, this strange thing happened, which is that the drug cartels in Mexico started sending more Mexican heroin across the border north into the United States. And from the outside, I looked at this and I just didn't really understand. Why is it that suddenly you'd see this uptick in heroin? And it turns out that the answer was consumer demand. Almost overnight, there was much more demand among American consumers for Mexican heroin. So this seemed a little strange, seemed like a riddle. And as I dug deeper, I learned that the reason for this was the opioid crisis. Was that you had a generation of Americans who had started using opioids in the form of prescription drugs, legal drugs that were prescribed to them by doctors. And these drugs were chemical cousins of heroin, but were legal, they were regulated by the FDA, and people started developing addictions to these drugs, problems with these drugs, and then eventually they would graduate to heroin for a variety of reasons. It might have gotten harder to access the legal stuff, might be more expensive to do so. Heroin was readily available, it was cheap. And these cartels, because they were very clever about this stuff, is they were always looking to sort of find ways to make it available, make it a substitute. They wanted people to move off of the prescription drugs and onto heroin, and they were very good at that. So I started looking into the opioid crisis, and I learned that it's this tremendously complex public health crisis that's unfolded over 25 years and, as was mentioned earlier, has killed some 500,000 Americans since the mid-1990s. But the origins of the crisis were actually less complex. In 1996, you had the introduction of a drug called OxyContin, and it was this groundbreaking new painkiller, an opioid. That is to say, it derives from the opium poppy. And it was prescribed in a different way than any opioid had been before. There was a huge marketing push to get more doctors to prescribe it to more patients more quickly for longer periods of time. And if the doctors had reservations about doing so, historically the reservations about opioids were that they were potentially addictive. But with OxyContin, the marketing pitch was, it's not addictive. We've cracked the code. It's addictive less than 1% of the time. So OxyContin becomes this huge success. Since 1996, it has generated some $35 billion in revenue. It became the biggest blockbuster drug of its day. And if you look at prescription patterns in the United States, the way that doctors prescribe opioids totally changes with the introduction of OxyContin. They suddenly start prescribing them much, much more. And this is the birth of the opioid crisis. But that wasn't really what got my attention. What got my attention as I dug into this was when I learned that BigPharma is not a publicly traded company. It's a privately held company, and it was owned entirely by this family called the Sackler family. And this really caught my eye, because if you grow up in the United States, and I would say the same would be true for the UK, the Sackler name is all around you. You may not know who the Sacklers are, you may never have given them much thought, but if you open your eyes and you look around, particularly at art museums and universities, at elite institutions, you'll often see this name, Sackler, engraved in marble or in stone. And the reason is that the family is tremendously generous, and in recent decades they've given away hundreds of millions of dollars in philanthropic donations primarily to art museums and to universities and to medical research. So I grew up in Boston. I worked for a year in Harvard Square after high school, near the Sackler Museum at Harvard. I went off to college at Columbia. And Columbia University actually has a whole bunch of Sackler facilities. The family's given a lot of money there. And sometimes I would go to the Met, to the Sackler wing of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which I'm sure some of you have been to. It's where they rebuilt that ancient Egyptian temple at the Met. And occasionally I'd go to the Guggenheim, where they have the Sackler Center for Arts Education. Sometimes I'd go to London and go to the Serpentine Sackler Gallery or the Sackler Gallery at the British Museum. I could go on. All around the world, there are Sackler wings and Sackler galleries, and this is what I knew the family for. So this struck me as really interesting, that you had this family that had this reputation for virtue and for generosity. That was what they were known for, and their name was everywhere. And I remember vividly, this is in 2017, I looked up the website of Purdue Pharma because I had read that the family owned the company and also they dominated its board of directors. So I went to the website of Purdue Pharma, the family company, which had made them all these billions of dollars, and I started looking for the family name. And it wasn't on the website. I couldn't find it anywhere. So there's this paradox. The name is everywhere in one realm and nowhere in the other. And it actually felt kind of deliberate to me that the name was missing from the company website. And so that was how I started this project. It started as an article in the New Yorker in 2017, and then it became this book that has just recently been published. And we'll talk about it. I should say, just before we get into the conversation, that my ambition was to not so much to write a book about the opioid crisis. In fact, OxyContin isn't introduced until about halfway through the book. What I learned as I dug into the family history is that there's this incredibly rich backstory involving earlier generations of the family. So this is actually kind of a multi-generational family saga that starts in Brooklyn during the Great Depression with this immigrant family, these three brothers who grow up to be doctors, and then tells the story of their children and their grandchildren. So it really spans from the 1920s up until today and covers a history, a sort of a century of American capitalism. And you may be wondering, if I wrote this biography of three generations of a family, I must have had a lot of access to the family. They probably gave me a lot of interviews. You would be wrong. The Sacklers are very hostile to this book. They started threatening to sue me before I had even started writing the book. It had just been announced in the trade press that I was going to write the book, and I got a 17-page single-spaced letter. Over the next 2 years, I got so many legal letters from lawyers for the Sacklers that if any of you have read Harry Potter, it's a bit like that scene at the beginning where the letters are coming in and they're coming through the chimney and they're coming under the door. So it was a strange situation in which I was trying to tell a story about this family that's quite intimate, but doing so in a way in which they were working very hard to stop me from doing so. For reasons we can get into if people are interested, I like a challenge like that. I think that sometimes it can make for a better article or a better book if you don't have access to the central source. And in this case, it meant I had to be creative. So what I did was I got access to tens of thousands of pages of internal documents, including internal private family emails, a private family WhatsApp log. I interviewed 200 people. I got private letters, privately published memoirs, all kinds of material. So that my hope is that when you read the book, you don't feel like you're looking at the family through a telescope, that you feel like you're in the room with them, and that the story is actually largely told through their own words, which I've been able to gather through other means. So I think I'm going to leave it at that, but I am eager for this conversation and then for any questions you have about this or any of my other work, and excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Well, that introduction makes it quite easy for me to start right away with the Sackler family. As you said, an immigrant family just before the First World War. I think they came to Brooklyn from Ukraine, Poland, Eastern Europe. The parents began a grocery store in Brooklyn, not too successful, I think. It was a difficult time, right? And eventually these three brothers, Arthur, Mortimer, and Richard, go study medicine. What happens in between? Tell us, what is the story of this family and these three relatively poor kids?
So you have these parents, Isaac and Sophie, who come to the United States not speaking English, and have these 3 boys. And it's in some ways, I think, a quite archetypal story of American ambition. They want their children to thrive. They want them to make money. They want all 3 kids to become doctors. Arthur Sackler, the oldest brother, would later joke that by the age of 4, he knew he would become a doctor because his mother kept telling him that he would become a doctor. And honestly, I think that there's a kind of beautiful and idealistic and romantic aspect to those early years where there was a sense, with the big caveat that they were Jewish, so they faced actually terrible discrimination and challenges associated with being Jewish during this period. But they were white and they were men, and there was a sense that if you were a young white American male in the early decades of the 20th century, it didn't matter if you were poor, didn't matter where your parents came from. In the span of a single lifetime, you could make an enormous fortune. You could create generational wealth. You could create a legacy that would endure long after you died. And so that was sort of the spirit in which these 3 kids grew up, and
which is a beautiful all-American immigration story. Until then.
Yeah, I think so.
With struggles, but...
Yeah, with struggles, and part of what's interesting to me about this narrative is ambition. Ambition is a double-edged thing, right? Ambition is inspiring and kind of rousing to read about, and there's a charisma that comes with it, there's a line, I didn't use it in the book, but something I sometimes thought about is, there was that, I think it's Steve Jobs had said that there are some people who just want to put a dent in the universe. And that's such an interesting concept, I think, because I do think that there are some people who do.
Is that what drove them as well? What
a little bit,
them
yeah,
to become doctors?
yeah. But I guess what I'm saying is I think it's an idea. It's a sort of not necessarily immoral, but an amoral idea, right? It's like if you're the universe, that doesn't sound so good. I think there was a sort of a bid for immortality that they had and for a fortune. And so you have these 3 guys who grew up. They all become doctors. The 2 younger brothers get excluded from medical school in the United States because there were Jewish quotas at the time. And so you have this kind of crazy notion that this family that fled Europe to come to the United States for more opportunity, within 1 generation, the 2 younger boys have to go back to Europe. They go to Scotland to go to medical school.
Was there a particular reason why all 3 of them wanted to go into medicine?
I think that the parents perceived medicine as a noble profession, but also a very stable one.
Right.
I think there was a sense that there's something unimpeachable about doctors.
Right. Which apparently is not true, but we'll get to that later.
Yeah.
You focus most of at least the first chapters of the book, quite a big part of the book, on one of the brothers in particular, Arthur Sackler, who dies in 1987, which is a decade before OxyContin, the notorious drug, is being introduced. Why focus on him so much? He's an intriguing character, obviously. He's an art collector and everything. What makes him so important, even though he didn't even live to see OxyContin, get big?
Yeah, it's a great question and one that's come up often. It's funny, I have this colleague at the New Yorker, Jane Mayer, who wrote a wonderful book about the Koch brothers. Koch brothers, these kind of big-time donors to conservative and libertarian causes in the United States. And when we talk about the Koch brothers, we're really talking about 2 Koch brothers. There are 4 Koch brothers. So there are the 2 who are involved in politics, and then there's a Koch brother who collects wine primarily, and then a 4th one who collects castles. And
castles?
Yeah.
Okay.
And Jane didn't really spend too much time on the wine collecting Koch brother or the castle collecting Koch brother, for good reason, because the kind of center of her story was about money and politics. For me, I suppose you could ask a similar question. Why focus a third of the book on Arthur Sackler, this guy who dies before the launch of OxyContin? And there are 2 answers. One is, I think Arthur Sackler is one of the great characters of the 20th century. I think he was a totally extraordinary figure. to me, he feels like he walked out of the pages of a Saul Bellow novel.
3 wives.
3 wives, yes.
Which is not extraordinary, but they
in and of itself. The overlap was interesting. There's a period I described late in the book where there were 3 different women living in Manhattan, all of whom went by the name Mrs. Arthur M. Sackler. I feel like this could only happen in the pre-internet era. But Arthur's connection is actually more intimate than that, in the sense that he, I would argue, created the world in which OxyContin would later do what it did. So Arthur Sackler goes to medical school, but as a teenager, when his family loses everything during the Depression, he's had to work. And the way he finds work is in advertising. He writes advertising copy, he becomes the advertising chief for his high school newspaper. He sells Chesterfield cigarette ads, so he advertises Chesterfield cigarettes to his fellow high school students. And he ends up going into the pharmaceutical business, but specifically into pharmaceutical advertising. And you know, if any of you have watched the show Mad Men, in the 1950s, Arthur is kind of the Don Draper of pharmaceutical advertising. He's got this incredible grasp for how you sell medicines. And he realizes that it's not really the consumer you sell to, it's the doctor. Right. And you sort of seduce the physician because the physician writes the prescriptions. And I interviewed for this book all these old guys, it's all guys in their 90s now, who were in the pharma ad business in the 50s. And they would all say, Arthur Sackler invented the wheel. He invented this business. He was so creative, so protean. He had so many ideas.
He made Valium big, right?
He made Valium what it was. When Roche introduced the drug Valium, which at the time was the great blockbuster drug of its era, also known to be addictive, the marketing plan was designed by Arthur Sackler, and he made a deal with Roche where he said, I don't want to do a standard fee arrangement. What I want is a series of performance bonuses pegged to the volume of pills you sell and not capped. So it just goes up and up and up and up and up, and the drug then becomes the most successful drug in the history of the pharmaceutical business at the time. So he becomes hugely wealthy selling Valium. And so Arthur does die in 1987, but what he does during his lifetime is break down the boundaries between medicine and commerce and kind of set into motion a series of very lucrative conflicts of interest and create a marketing paradigm for how you market a drug that is potentially addictive. And he kind of sets all this stuff up. And then the amazing thing is he dies in 87, and as I tell the story, his nephew, Richard Sackler, kind of takes up the baton and takes it to its next extreme with OxyContin.
Just sticking to Arthur for a bit, it's basically, it's a very American story, but it's also a deadly cocktail in a sense that it's, Americans love medicine and love painkillers because, if you have a problem, there's no problem that you cannot fix with either money or painkillers. And then on the other hand, it's an addiction to marketing, whether it's selling a politician or selling, in this case, medicine. It's those two things that come together, and that's where the ruining of America basically starts, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that so the story in the kind of immediate sense is about this family and this pharmaceutical dynasty, but in a broader sense, it's a story about power and influence, right, and the way in which you can, in the American system, and I'm sure there are aspects of the system here in the Netherlands that are very similar. I mean, as probably with all things, we Americans tend to take it to a certain extreme. But with enough power and influence, if you're canny, there's sort of nothing that can't be bought. Right. And there's a whole realm of corruption that's not necessarily illegal corruption. I think of it as kind of soft corruption. But the revolving door between regulatory agencies and private industry. The ways in which powerful lawyers with good connections can be leveraged to spring you out of trouble. when the authorities are coming after you. We see Arthur Sackler do all this, and then we see it later with subsequent generations and OxyContin.
Until then, until OxyContin is introduced, well, even after, I guess, but it's parallel tracks, because the introduction of the drug, which we'll talk about, was happening, and then at the same time, you mentioned it in your introduction, the Sackler name was being put on museums, he was collecting art, and they didn't give interviews, but he really wanted the name to be seen everywhere, right? So he wanted to be a big society person in New York?
Yeah, I mean, there's this...
but shy at the same time.
At the same time. So there's this, so there's this strange thing, which is that Arthur Sackler's whole business was conflicts of interest. And you really need to read the book to get the full measure of it. But I mean, he's in pharmaceutical advertising, but he also owned, was an owner with his brothers of a pharmaceutical company, and he also had a medical newspaper, which was given free to physicians, but it didn't acknowledge that he owned the newspaper, and it had a lot of coverage written by journalists that was very favorable to the pharmaceutical industry, and it advertised drugs that his brothers made, and it handled other ads that came for products that he represented with his advertising agency, and none of this is ever disclosed. So, and then there's, leaving aside the issue of the wives. So for Arthur, there was a sense in which he actually wanted to remain anonymous and behind the scenes as much as he could, I think for fear that if everything was disclosed, people might start asking uncomfortable questions. At the same time, he has this desire to emblazon the family name all over the place. And I couldn't really understand this. There's a wonderful line, I was talking to an Irish interviewer about this book. I think he came up with this off the cuff. And I was talking about the mania of the Sacklers for putting their name on buildings. And then this interviewer said, so it's as if they had an edifice complex. So they have this edifice complex where they're putting up the name. And I was trying to understand that, and I made this discovery. I was a ways into the research for the book, of this story that I tell in the book about Isaac Sackler, the original patriarch, who during the Depression loses everything. His businesses kind of go belly up. And he gathers his 3 sons who are just kids to him, and he tells them, we had such great plans for you to become doctors, for you to get education, but I can't pay for it. I don't have any money to give you. But then he says, but I have given you one thing, and it's the most important thing that a parent can give a child. I've given you a good name. And he says, if you lose a fortune, you can always go out and earn another fortune. But if you lose your good name, you can never get it back. And it's not too much longer after that Arthur starts making money. And as soon as he starts making money, he starts making donations. And as soon as he makes donations, he has his lawyers say, let's be clear, this is a transaction. This is not just charity here. This is a business deal. You're going to put the name above the door. So it's this weird thing where he's trying to kind of obscure his own business relationships, but also sort of posit the Sackler name as this great emblem of prestige.
Now, during the writing process, and I don't know if you unraveled all this in a chronological order, but did you develop, perhaps in the beginning, any or some sympathies for Arthur?
Yeah, I think if you read the book, well, before I even say that, there's a phrase that I often think about when I'm writing, which is, I've done some screenwriting over the years for Hollywood. Nothing that you would have seen, because none of it's gotten made.
It was very niche.
Yeah, exactly, very, very niche. So niche, in fact, that nobody made it. But there's a wonderful adage among screenwriters that when you're writing a villain in a movie, it's important to remember that if it's going to be a good villain, that your villain doesn't think he's the villain in the movie.
Right.
Your villain thinks he's the hero of the movie. It's a whole other movie for the villain. And in real life, most villains don't twirl their mustache and kind of cackle and know that they're the villain. And for me, when I'm writing, I think it's a useful rule of thumb because it's important to remember that these are human beings, and you may stand in judgment of them, but the story looks very different to them than it does to you. And I think that even if you are quite harsh with them in your assessment of them, which I am, I would say with Arthur and some of these others, I'm not looking to caricature these people. I want to understand them. So that would be true if I'm writing about Chapo Guzman or anyone else. In the case of Arthur, he's so charismatic. He's this amazing kind of life force. I think it's hard not to be seduced just a little bit. And
he's also an asshole to his whole family.
He is an asshole. But to me, this is what makes him so rich as a character, right? Is that he can be both. And he's one of those people, I've written about these people from time to time who, my last book was about the Northern Ireland. Jerry Adams is one of these people too, where everyone around them is kind of obsessed with them. And sometimes they are obsessed with them and love them. Sometimes they're obsessed with them and hate them. But everyone has a very strong view. And even long after these people are dead, the kind of riddle of that person, the paradox of that person continues to haunt all the people who knew them. And Arthur Sackler was one of those people.
Let's go to OxyContin, which again was introduced in 1996, or it was admitted into the market. Set the scene for us, because the Reagan years were over. The Reagan Revolution was over. There was a big sense of that the government should be small, not too much regulation, right? Is that how they got this medicine, OxyContin, approved? Because before, people said that oxycodone, which is which is part of OxyContin, was too addictive, and therefore it would not be permitted by the medicine authority, right? How come they accepted it even to enter the market?
Well, so there's a sort of a broad answer and a specific one. The broad answer would be that there was a reconsideration going on of the way in which pain is treated during this period of time. There were many doctors who felt that, certainly in the United States, in the UK, and elsewhere, that pain had not been adequately treated, that doctors didn't have a lot of education in pain, that doctors tended to think of pain as just a symptom of another thing and not as a condition in itself that they should aggressively treat, and that they were reluctant to prescribe opioids, these kind of miraculous drugs that derive from the opium poppy, and that the reason that they'd been reluctant to do that was a fear of opioids being addictive. So, people used morphine and other opioids for cancer patients, end-of-life care. But it was kind of the solution that you kept on the top shelf and you reached for it when other things failed, or when somebody was at the end of their life. And OxyContin came along just at the point where a number of doctors were saying, maybe we've been too conservative in our use of these drugs and we've let people suffer needlessly in pain. Maybe we should rethink this. So the timing was great. The company also made a bunch of claims that in retrospect were totally bogus about the drug. They said, our drug is different from anything that's come before, because they had this seal. So when you say OxyContin, so oxycodone is where you get the oxy from, and that's an opioid. If you've ever taken Percocet, oxycodone is an ingredient in Percocet. And the content part is for continuous. So there's a seal that slowly filters the active ingredient into your bloodstream over, in theory, 12 hours. In practice, it didn't last that long. And the idea was when you do it that way, you can give somebody a huge dose, 80 milligrams. At the time, they had a 160 milligram pill of OxyContin. It's pure oxycodone, way bigger than anything that you would have had, certainly in a Percocet or something like that. And the notion was that you just take it twice a day. You have to take it once every 12 hours. It means you could sleep through the night. It's a great marketing pitch. But wouldn't doctors be worried to prescribe it? That was one concern. And then the other concern the company had was they had previously had a cancer pain drug, and they said, the problem is there's only so many cancer patients. What if we could find a way to market this for other kinds of pain? Back pain, sports injuries, fibromyalgia, chronic pain, not even just severe pain. What about moderate pain? That could be tens of millions of people. And that was what they wanted to position the drug for. So how do you do that? Well, you have to overcome the reluctance of physicians to do it, and so you claim that it's not addictive, which is what they did. So that was the marketing pitch.
That's how they got permission from the Food and Drug Administration to even...
Well, this is still part of the general background. Okay. The specific story is the guy at the Food and Drug Administration who was in charge was a guy named Curtis Wright, who was an official at the FDA, who had to sign off on the drug, say it was safe to sell to consumers, and also sign off on the marketing claims that they could make, those bogus marketing claims I talked about. He signed off on everything. And not too long after that, Curtis Wright decided he might be ready to leave government. And eventually he gets a job in the pharmaceutical industry. And I'll give you one guess what company he goes and works for 3 times his government salary.
$400,000.
Mm-hmm. So Curtis Wright was this guy whose job it was to sort of be the gatekeeper, and he ends up sort of being the in-house advocate at the FDA for OxyContin, and then goes and joins the company.
So it's basically corruption.
I mean, again,
not in the most literal sense, but
this would be soft corruption in my view. I mean, it's hard. You couldn't even find somebody at FDA or at Purdue Pharma who would tell you that that's appropriate, but it's not illegal. I'm afraid that sort of thing happens all the time. I mean, I just saw this again and again and again in terms of industry and government, that a lot of the time it's as simple as you and I meet. Your job is to regulate me. We have to meet because you're regulating me and deciding whether or not you can sell my drug. One day we have a coffee in a breakout session, and I say, so how long have you been in government? You ever think about leaving? Do you ever think about getting a job in industry? Well, if you ever do, we should have a conversation. I've planted the seed. That's it. I've corrupted you. I've done nothing illegal, but the idea is now
I'm easily corrupted.
Well, you were corrupted long ago. Yeah, but I'm pushing on an open door. But I think that sort of thing happens. That sort of interaction happens all the time, and it's hard to legislate that. It's hard to control it.
So my premise of this company, surfing the wave of the need for a small state deregulation, that wasn't really part of that. I mean, it wasn't the case that these authorities just were not very powerful anymore.
There's some of that. I think that comes later when the federal government realizes there's a problem and they're wondering what they can do about it.
Right. Now you mentioned that Arthur or the Sacklers, they chose to not aim for the patients but for the doctors. Make their life as comfortable as they could. I think you write in a book that they spent, this company, I think $6 million a year just for food and taking doctors out to dinner, right?
9 million, yeah.
9 million. What else did they do? I mean, how did they get these doctors to write, hundreds and thousands of prescriptions every year?
So one of the critiques of the way in which pain had been treated was that doctors did not get a lot of formal education in medical school about the treatment of pain, and that was true. That was a totally legitimate critique. The company hired hundreds and hundreds of sales representatives and incentivized them in this interesting way. What they said was, we will give you bonuses. The bonuses will be pegged to the volume of pills that you can get doctors to prescribe. We're going to track it all very carefully. And at every other pharmaceutical company, your bonus was capped. And at Purdue Pharma, it wasn't. So the more you get doctors to prescribe, the bigger your bonus is. And it gets to a point where you have people making like $200,000 a quarter as a sales rep for Purdue Pharma. And they would go out, meet with doctors, wine and dine them, bring them food, any way they could incentivize them. The sales reps were notoriously often young females, right out of college, often quite attractive, going in, meeting with, harried, middle-aged male doctors. I don't mean to suggest that anything untoward was happening. It's a little bit like the conversation I just described to you. Every little subtle dynamic, anything that can give you a tiny edge was used. And, I've interviewed a bunch of these sales reps. And they're going out and they're lying. They're saying the drug's not addictive. And they would identify doctors who were, to my way of looking at things, really irresponsible. Doctors who were prescribing too much.
And they were profiting from every prescription.
They profited from every, so those were the doctors they lavished attention on. And the company told them to. Inside the company, they had a name for those doctors. They called them whales, which is in Vegas what you call the big ticket gamblers.
They would keep track of how many prescriptions every doctor wrote.
Every pill. Which also meant that the company knew that, when you had some little rural osteopath in a tiny little part of Pennsylvania, 100 miles from anything, with a very small local population, and he's like fire hosing OxyContin in every direction, they knew, because they had those numbers, that they knew that the volume of pills that they were selling in this area was totally out of proportion to the local population. And it's that times 1,000. They knew this everywhere because they tracked that data very carefully.
And this was mostly still, OxyContin is being used in big cities as well, but this was mostly a flyover country problem back then. Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Vermont,
Initially, it pops up in these very specific places. Yeah, Maine as well. It's these often quite rural, in some cases post-industrial, sort of Rust Belt type environments, generally white, working class, a lot of people out of work, a lot of people working kind of tough manual labor jobs, a lot of people suffering from pain.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And the medicine worked. What about the other companies? Because the book obviously focuses on Purdue Pharma, and reading the book, it's hard to believe that there are other companies as immoral as this company is. But there were plenty more.
There were. As I said at the outset, the opioid crisis is a big, complex story. You don't get there with one family. As they say, it takes a village. And there were, I would argue that there's total system failure in terms of every public institution that should have intervened. There are also a whole bunch of other pharmaceutical companies. I chose to focus on the Sacklers because I think that Purdue was first. I think they were the ones who changed the game. There's somebody I quote in the book who worked on OxyContin at the company who said it was the tip of the spear. So there were many others who came in after, and many of these companies are now dealing with the consequences of that. And so I think there's plenty of blame to go around. I don't mean to suggest for a moment that this is a story in which the Sacklers are the only culprits. I think they were the first, and I think they are the most interesting.
Right. Was there any particular time in which you could give the Sacklers the benefit of the doubt, in the sense that did they know from the beginning that they were selling a product which was much more addictive than they originally portrayed? Or did they just realize that later and didn't jump in?
I've thought a lot about this. I think this is in large part a story about willful blindness. And in the first instance, part of the reason they didn't know whether OxyContin was addictive or not is they didn't do any studies on it before they put the drug out there and said that it wasn't addictive.
Right.
There were a lot of unanswered questions that weren't answered because they weren't asked in the early going. In terms of what I said about the villain in the movie, I am kind of inclined to give them a little bit of the benefit of the doubt, in the sense that, so that was just reckless, just purely reckless what they did, and greedy. And I think there was a sort of element of wishful thinking. They thought, like, what if we, literally they thought, for thousands of years, humans have struggled with opioids because, on the one hand, they have these amazing therapeutic benefits. They can make pain go away. It's true. But on the other hand, they can be really addictive. And we've known that. You go back, you can go back a long way. There's a very long literature on this. And so there's the hubris of them saying, until us, we cracked it. We figured it out. We've got this seal. So I think there's hubris and recklessness there. But for me, where it gets really morally grave is when it turns out that hypothesis is wrong. And in short order, all those sales representatives, those hundreds of sales representatives who are out across the country, like the eyes and ears, they start hearing that people are abusing the drug. People are getting addicted to it. People are overdosing. People are dying. And word goes back to headquarters. The company and the Sacklers have long told lies about when they learned, like what they knew and when they knew it. I was able to substantiate that at a very high level in the company, they knew very soon, in the 1990s, that there were real severe problems.
Because the people they sent to the field were truly alarmed, most of them.
I don't know that they were all alarmed.
Some had a conscience.
Some had a conscience. And even the ones who didn't have a conscience were kind of, would write these notes. I've seen them where they say, you know, I talked to the doctor. The doctor keeps talking about the street value of OxyContin. You know, not a good sign when you're selling a controlled substance. And these notes would go back. And I guess, so just on the question of when do you give them the benefit of the doubt, for me, my harshest assessment would be, and think about it, for any of you, truly, you have a product, you put it out in the world. It's a smashing success. You're making billions of dollars. People are telling you you're a genius. All your rival companies are trying to take a page out of your book and do the same thing. And then your employees come in and they say, so I'll tell you what, it's killing people. It's killing people. And you know, it's probably not an option to stop the train, but I think it might be an option to slow the train down a little and say, hey, let's look at our marketing. Is there something we're doing wrong? And what's amazing about the Sacklers and their company is when word came back, what they said was full speed ahead.
I remember I've done stories on OxyContin, and I think in Florida where at a certain time the pandemic was, I mean, it was hit pretty hard. And we went filming at, I think they called it a pill mill, basically just a doctor's office. But this doctor would have bodyguards, armed bodyguards who would bring him to his car as if he was some mafioso, basically. Was that common practice? This was more a mobster than a doctor, and you would see it all over. I mean, some doctors must have felt guilty, but I guess for some it was just too lucrative.
Yeah, I mean, it's a continuum. You always have crooks. In this case, there were many doctors who essentially you would. It's like a cash business. You know, people come in, they pay whatever it is that they give you $40, and you give them a fake prescription. You give them a prescription for a condition they don't have, and then they go to a pharmacy. Sometimes the pharmacy was in on it too.
The doctors became drug dealers. In a sense.
The doctors completely became drug dealers, and many of them ended up going to jail.
Right.
But what is interesting to me is that the company back in Connecticut that's making all the money, I mean, not making like $40 for a phony prescription, it's making billions of dollars every year, they're getting these reports from their sales representatives who are like, I did my call on the clinic in Florida. There was a line of 40 people outside the door. The parking lot is filled with out-of-state license plates. You know, some people brought deck chairs because the wait was so long. It doesn't look like a doctor's office, you know? Yeah.
Right.
And when asked about this, subsequently, you know, people at the company would say, you know, it's not our job to judge how doctors practice medicine.
Right. Right. And that was it.
That was it.
When did the tables eventually turn on them?
I mean, have they?
Well, we'll get to that. There was a settlement that we'll talk about. But I mean, they like you said in your introduction, you couldn't even find the Sackler name on the website of Purdue Pharma. Quite a bit was written about Purdue Pharma, but even then the name wouldn't come up. But that changed at a certain time.
Yeah, there's sort of two timelines. I mean, the first is having to do with the company. And in 2001, newspapers around the country start covering what's happening because it's clear there's a big problem. OxyContin's killing people in significant numbers. There's a lot of crime associated with OxyContin. The New York Times, I tell the story, Barry Meyer, who was an investigative reporter at the New York Times, who writes a series of really groundbreaking stories about this. So it starts to catch up with the company. In 2007, there's a federal criminal investigation in Virginia, and the company actually pleads guilty and pays a $600 million fine. But nobody goes to jail, and it doesn't touch the Sacklers. What's really remarkable is that OxyContin develops people refer to it as hillbilly heroin. It develops a reputation. There's a lot of controversy around the drug and the company, but it doesn't catch up with the family. And this is what's so intriguing to me, is the family during this period is still giving money away, still going to ribbon cuttings. Their name is still going up left and right. You know, they can show up at benefits and galas and nobody's asking them impertinent questions.
But how's that possible? How is it possible that nobody made the connection, basically? I mean, there are many good, curious journalists like yourself.
They did. They just didn't. I mean, Barry Meyer wrote about it.
Right.
Barry Meyer said this company is owned by the Sacklers. I think a few things happened. They had scrupulously kind of distanced themselves in the public eye from the company. They had very aggressive lawyers who, anytime anybody started to think about writing about them, the lawyers came at them like a ton of bricks. They had PR spin doctors. I mean, there were these amazing emails that I got where there would be some really awful article about Purdue Pharma and what happened at the company, and the article will get circulated internally at the company, and they'll say, it's not too bad. They didn't mention the Sacklers till the end. So there's a sort of strange sense in which the company takes the brunt of the negative coverage, and the family is protected. There's a quote actually from a family lawyer that I quote in the book who said, the objective is to protect the family at all costs. There's something almost kind of mafiosi about this tendency. So it doesn't catch up with them really until 2018.
Would all this have been different if most deaths would not have been in flyover country? I mean, the politicians don't go there as much as they. I mean, if this was a Washington, New York, Los Angeles problem, would it have been solved earlier? Or not solved, but more people would have been alarmed.
That's a fascinating question, and I don't really know how to answer it. I mean, maybe, but the flip side of that is, it's interesting because there's a whole language that we now use to talk about the opioid crisis where you may hear, I may have already said it, and if I haven't, I will, but when I talk about people who've been addicted to OxyContin, I call them victims. And I think there's an effort to destigmatize this kind of addiction, in part because, and I haven't explained this part yet, but what the Sacklers in Purdue did, once it became clear that people were dying from the drug, they made this kind of fascinating pivot where they said, well, the problem isn't the drug.
Right.
It's the abusers. It's these reckless people with poor moral character who would really be addicted to anything. They kind of want to be addicted.
Guns don't kill people.
Guns don't kill people. People kill people. And this is I'm afraid, a powerful strain in a kind of American libertarian thought, and it sort of took hold. And I think that was another way the family was insulated and the company was insulated. But I talk about victims. I think that's good. We're sort of destigmatizing people who struggle with these drugs.
Right.
But there are many people who say, rightly, where was all this talk about victims during the crack epidemic when these people were black in the 1980s? And so I don't know. I mean, the crack epidemic was in the cities. It was people who were not powerful and were often kind of marginalized and disenfranchised by society who suffered there. But I don't know that the feeling of urgency was any greater there.
Now, while reading the book, I kept wondering, and I'm not a psychologist, and I believe neither are you, but it would have. I mean, it maybe would have even helped the Sacklers case if they would have shown remorse in some sense. But they don't do it in any sense. Not now, not in '96.
Yeah, I mean, it's the weirdest thing. You try really hard to understand people. I interviewed many people who've worked for the family and known the family and worked at the company over the years. And one of the things that's so startling is that there are people who told me, I went to them 10 years ago and said, you give all this money away. What if you set up a foundation and put $100 million in it, which is nothing to you, and said, this is to help treat the opioid crisis, the victims of the opioid crisis.
It would have been pocket money.
And it would have been, and they could have at that point then, they could today look back and say, look, for 10 years we've been doing X, Y, and Z. There's always been resistance. I think for a number of reasons. I think that rhetorically they didn't even want to acknowledge that there was an opioid crisis. One of the amazing emails that I got from just quite recently that's in my book is Mortimer Sackler Jr., a second generation Sackler, I think in 2019, in an email to family members talking about the so-called opioid crisis. So this is the way they talk in private. So I think some of it is they don't want to acknowledge the opioid crisis. Some of it is this desire to demonize the people, to essentially say the people who get addicted to drugs, it's kind of on them. It's not, nothing to do with us. So why would we show any sympathy? Some of it is a fear that they would appear to be conceding wrongdoing.
Right, and they're aggressive until the very end. You mentioned in the book John Oliver, the comic, who has done several segments which you can find on YouTube on OxyContin and on the Sackler family. And when they find out that he's doing these segments, they're suing him, or at least trying to sue him, or warning him with letters and everything. And that's very common, right? They're trying to stop you from writing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this was it was a tactic, and I think it worked for a long time. This kind of heavy-handed, somebody wants to say, hey, it seems there's problems with this drug, rather than say, we're very interested, my goodness, is our drug killing people? That makes me uncomfortable. What they would say is, you'll be hearing from my lawyer. And it worked for a long time.
Right.
It didn't work with John Oliver. It didn't work with me. I mean, I don't think it works anymore.
Right. Your book came out in the US, I think you said April, right? Which was conveniently, at a convenient time. There were lawsuits going on, and this September there was a settlement in which the Sacklers were, I think the plaintiffs were about like thousands of states and cities and individuals, right? And they sued them, and I think they have to pay $4 or $5 billion, the Sacklers.
Yeah.
Which is not a lot of money.
It's not a lot of money
for them.
No, I mean I should just to clarify, they ended up in bankruptcy.
Right.
So it's not that they were sued and those cases went to trial. What happened was there were more and more and more lawsuits against the company, and eventually against the Sacklers themselves. And they did this amazing thing in 2019 where they said, company's got no money anymore. And they kicked it into bankruptcy. And you may be wondering, $35 billion in revenue, how does the company have no money anymore? So it turns out that for 10 years, the family had been quietly siphoning money out of its own company. They took more than $10 billion out of the company. And then when all these lawsuits came, they declared bankruptcy for the company. And the outcome of the bankruptcy, which has just been finalized this month, is that they will give up their interest in the company. They have pledged to pay $4.5 billion to help remediate the opioid crisis, right. But they will make no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. And this bankruptcy judge is going to insulate them from any future liability. So all those thousands of lawsuits, none of them can proceed. They've all been stopped permanently. So there's no future liability for the family.
Not for new lawsuits either.
No,
basically immune for any lawsuit now.
Immune from any lawsuits relating to any of this.
Which, if you have, as a family, $12 billion or $11 billion, and you have to pay through this system $4 billion, but then you're immune, you're basically off the hook.
Absolutely, and to put a finer point on it, I was interested in this because the thing about the $4.5 billion. So first of all, the cost of the opioid crisis at this point is more than $2 trillion. So 4.5 billion it sounds like a lot, but it's not a lot. The other respect in which it's not a lot is that, so the family has roughly $11 billion, an $11 billion fortune, that's the estimate. They're going to pay the $4.5 billion out over 9 years, they insisted. And I did some research and talked to some people who invest big fortunes for high net worth families. And I said, if I have an $11 billion fortune, what kind of annualized rate of return can I expect just in terms of interest and like a very conservative investment portfolio? They said 5 to 6%. So I said, okay, so say I have a $4.5 billion penalty that I need to pay out, but I can pay it out over 9 years. And they said, oh, you don't have to touch your principal. You can just pay it with your returns. When you're done paying the penalty, you'll be richer than you are today. So it's one of these kind of interesting things I think about billionaire math, right? Is we see $4.5 billion and it seems like a lot, and they see $4.5 billion over 9 years, and they think, we'll be better off at the end.
I mean, with that conclusion, does your book, do you feel vindictive in a sense, or not at all? I mean, their name has been damaged forever. It's you know, the Metropolitan, most of these museums don't use the Sackler name anymore, I believe. Some?
I would say most still do.
Most still do. Okay.
I mean, the trickiest thing is that these are, as I mentioned earlier, it was a transaction, right? So that means it's a contract, and the binding contract. So many of these museums which would like, they've all said that they won't take future money,
right?
But they're scared to take the name down.
But would it then be fair to say that after this whole saga, that they came out of this pretty good?
Well, I think it depends on how you look at it. I mean, yes, in terms of justice and accountability, and money. This is a story of impunity, and if you, I actually think we haven't given away too much tonight. And if you do read the book, you'll see that impunity is in some ways its subject. It was always going to end this way. This is a story in which the bad guys were always going to get away with it in the end. Right. The one bit of solace that I think people can take comes from that story about Isaac Sackler, where he said, the most important thing that you can give a child is a good name. And money is fungible. You lose a fortune, you can earn another fortune. But if you lose your good name, you can never get it back. And the name is coming down. It's come down at NYU. It came down from the Louvre. The Serpentine Sackler Gallery is now just the Serpentine again. Came down from Tufts University. There was I took personal interest in an interview that the head of the Metropolitan Museum of Art gave to Time magazine. The Met Gala is this big annual kind of event. And the head of the Met did an interview with Time magazine and was asked, well, what about the Sacklers? What about the Sacklers? Will the Sackler wing remain the Sackler wing? And he said, we are considering that right now. We are having active conversations about whether we'll take the name down or keep it up. And then he said, I've been reading this book, Empire of Pain, which, who knows what they'll do, but I'm encouraged to think that he's reading.
Right. Before we get to audience questions, just a final thing about how you wrote this book. In the sense that the Sacklers didn't want to talk to you, obviously. At the same time, I think you just mentioned, unless I misunderstood you, that you had access to a WhatsApp conversation of the family, which usually includes only family members. So I would assume that maybe you did talk to someone at the family.
Oh, well...
I have a family WhatsApp group as well, and it's really hard to get into. If you're not part of my family.
That's what you think.
Right.
So a couple of things. I mean, I had many sources. And it is true, certainly, that when you do what I do, there are people who you talk to on the record, who you can name, and there are people who you talk to in other ways who you're not able to name. So I wouldn't say anything really more than that in terms of the particulars of who I didn't talk to. But just to dispel any speculation, with that WhatsApp log, that came out in litigation. A lot of the stuff some of the documentary stuff I got was leaked to me by insiders who did give me emails that have never been seen anywhere else and haven't come out in court cases. But a huge amount of the material I got, some of it really amazing, came out because it was subpoenaed by lawyers, and then sometimes it was sealed and it would be shared with me even though it shouldn't be, and other times it was unsealed and it came out and anybody could go and get it.
Right. And that is my final question, because it's just hard for me to grasp. Every family, whether it's the Trump family or the Murdoch family, owned Fox, or the HBO series Succession, every one of these New York families would have a black sheep, the least favorite kid. And one of these least favorite kids would talk to you. How come this Sackler family has remained so close? It's just hard to...
Well, I mean, they haven't remained close. And it's funny, there's a line I have at the end of the book where I talk about how over the years I spent researching this, there were 3 different people who independently told me that they said, if you really want to understand what it's like working for the Sacklers, have you seen this show Succession? There's actually a lot of rivalry and infighting. There's a lot that the Sacklers don't agree on. And there are these hilarious descriptions of people I quote in the book talking about going to board meetings, and the board meetings are dominated by the family members, and the family members just kind of bicker the whole time, and they're fighting, and somebody will say something rude, and then, Jonathan will say something rude to Kathy, and then somebody tries to move on, and Kathy says, well, we're not going to move on until Jonathan apologizes. And, and this poor person is trying to do a PowerPoint presentation about new business lines, and just like awkward, sitting there frozen, wondering if they should move to slide 3. So there's a lot they don't get along on. The strange thing is the one thing that they agree on uniformly is that they haven't done anything wrong, that they're terribly misunderstood. They probably wouldn't put it in precisely these terms, but the implication is that the real victim of the opioid crisis is actually the Sackler family. Right. I looked and looked for an apostate. I looked for somebody, some third generation Sackler. They're like, they're like filmmakers and singer-songwriters. And there are these kind of younger Sacklers in the arts, or who are like junior philanthropists. And I really thought that some of them might have different views. And there was this one, Madeline Sackler, who I write about in the book, who's a third-generation Sackler, who's a filmmaker, and she makes these kind of politically progressive documentaries about how mass incarceration is terrible. And of course, what I was curious about is, I'm like, well, you wouldn't have mass incarceration in the United States if you didn't have the war on drugs. And part of what sustains the war on drugs is the opioid crisis. Has she given any thought to, the connection? And her response is generally, she didn't say this to me, she wouldn't talk to me, but her response is generally, well, she's like, I have nothing to do with the company. A lot of them, the third generation, will say sort of, so they have these trusts.
They use their money.
Yeah, with tons of money that comes from OxyContin, but they say, well, I wasn't on the board, so it's got nothing to do with me. Right. So I tried to find that person, but so far as I could tell, they don't exist.
Right. Well, we've, believe it or not, in the past hour, still only covered part of the book, so there's plenty of reason to read it, and everybody should. Are there questions from the audience? Like Martin said in the beginning, there's no microphone because of COVID rules, so you really have to yell. So that at least I can hear it and repeat the question. Yeah?
Thank you for a great evening. To what extent do you think that exposing the Sackler family as a criminal drug family will help end the opioid crisis? Or what, in your opinion, is necessary to start ending the opioid crisis?
Did everybody hear in the back?
Yeah.
So the question was, to what extent writing about the family and exposing the family might help end the opioid crisis, and more broadly, how might we start ending it? The bad news is that the crisis has gotten worse. We haven't talked about it as much because of COVID, but the COVID pandemic has actually intensified the opioid epidemic, and overdoses are way up. And if you think about it, the kind of isolation that people feel, the sort of social and economic dislocation that came with the coronavirus pandemic would lead people to relapse, lead people to overdose.
70,000, I think, last year, right?
Yeah, the numbers are astonishing. I identify really strongly as a journalist and not an activist. There's obviously a kind of moral conviction in what I'm writing. I have a strong point of view. But chiefly I see my role as telling a kind of irrefutable truth, hopefully in a way that is inviting to readers who might not otherwise engage with this issue, and in a way that cannot be expunged. And in some ways, this story, actually dating right back to the 1950s, is a story about marketing. It's a story about people taking one thing and pretending it's another. And so for my purposes, in a weird way, I don't even get to trying to end the opioid crisis, which is a sort of a very urgent but also quite overwhelming objective. I start a lot smaller, which is in 2017, when I looked around, I said, you have this family that kind of occupies one role in the public mind, and then you have the reality, and there's this gulf between those things, and I want to close that gulf. I want to establish a kind of legacy for them that feels more full and accurate. And in that respect, I have to say, I feel pretty good. I think they're fleeing New York City. It's a little harder for them, I think, to go out and about without getting asked questions.
They're moving to London, some, right?
Yeah, in Florida.
Of course.
And Switzerland. But and that's not just, that's not due to me. There's a story I tell in the book about the photographer Nan Golden, who led a great campaign where she went to these different museums, Nan Goldin, a legendary photographer who's recovering from an addiction to OxyContin, who kind of went on the warpath against the family. And so there's many, many people who've kind of contributed to this effort to bring home the truth. So if, they may be able to outrun justice, but they kind of run truth. In terms of the opioid crisis more broadly, I mean, it's going to take vast amounts of resources, far more than we have. It's going to take, I think, a really thorough destigmatization beyond what we've done so far. I think a lot of the, it's great. There are like shortages of the medications that can reverse an overdose, which is insane to think about. So there's a huge number of different connected parts. I think it's going to take either a kind of comprehensive national strategy with all the relevant resources, or more likely what it'll be, because we won't have that because we're bad at those, is just day-to-day work by people who, these people are such heroes, but people who work on recovery and treatment, and every day, every week, these people lose people to overdose. It's heartbreaking work, but I think in a weird way, that's probably the way it'll happen, is kind of community by community in a very local way.
Because it's hardly a political discussion. I mean, BigPharma is being talked about, but whenever there's a mass murder bloodbath, politicians in DC would start talking about guns, but this is not on their radar as much at all, even though 3 times as many people die from these painkillers than from gun wounds. Yeah,
and part of the reason for that is that the painkiller industry spends, I think the estimate is 8 times what the gun lobby spends on lobbying. I had this kind of mortifying experience where I was invited to testify before Congress about my book at a hearing about the Sacklers. And I testified for the House Oversight Committee. And the Republican ranking member of the committee was extremely hostile to me, and he sort of acted as if I was like a Democratic operative trying to score some kind of political point. It was not totally coherent in my mind how the Sacklers have anything to do with partisanship. But what happened is that each of the Republican members said they didn't want to talk about Purdue Pharma, they didn't want to talk about the Sacklers, they wanted to talk about the southern border and heroin coming up from the southern border. I think there is a kind of, politically speaking, it's still I think America is very good at thinking that like we're this sort of sweet virginal country that like people bring bad things into, and that we would be incapable of exporting bad things, or indeed of the kind of self-inflicted harm that I think you see with BigPharma.
Right. Other questions, I'm sure. Yeah, right in front.
Seriously, did the people who invented OxyContin, it was not the Sacklers themselves who invented it, I would assume, or did they? I would assume that there were scientists who invented it. And have any of them felt remorse?
The question is, I don't know if the people who developed OxyContin in the labs, but for the Sackler family, I suppose, if they showed any remorse.
Not that I've seen. I spoke to a number of the scientists who worked on it. I should say that there are some people who, including the inventor himself, a guy named Bob Keiko, who are so tied up in litigation that I could never speak to them, and they have not spoken candidly. Like, I have depositions that they've done in an adversarial legal context, but maybe on their deathbed they'll say something to a grandchild. I have no idea, but I don't think we're going to get real access to what they think, because they're so under threat of litigation that they aren't really in a position to speak candidly to anyone. I spent a lot of time talking to people who worked on OxyContin in one way or another, and what I found is people who were, I think, pretty deep in denial. And in some ways, I have to tell you that I'm emotionally sympathetic with them. And this would sort of go for the Sacklers as well. At the end of the book, I talk a little bit about the legend of Pandora's box, And I kind of think that's what this story is. I don't think anybody set out to kill lots of people. And I sat across from people like in Starbucks, you know, talking to them for hours about the role that they played with the drug. And the perception that I got was of people who were keeping the door very firmly closed to the possibility that they may have played some small role in unleashing a crisis that killed 500,000 people. Because if they let me open that door just a crack, it would all come rushing in. And I think it would get very hard to look at yourself in the mirror or get out of bed in the morning. So I felt often with the kind of the weird rationalizations that people would have and so forth, I sort of felt very powerfully that it was a story they were telling themselves because the alternative was just too demoralizing to consider.
Thank you. Other questions? In the back. Yeah.
Hi, Patrick, thank you for your talk. I'm an anesthesiologist pain physician here in Amsterdam, and I work for one of the major hospitals. I've been doing this for about 20 years. And I can tell you, I've heard a lot about the doctor point of view, what you pointed out, but I do want to, what I do miss in the story is also the pressure that's been put on by regulatory authorities on physicians, and also the marketing that happened. For example, pain, the fifth vital sign, right? So the whole society in general, at a certain point, because of these marketing efforts, had this idea that pain, you didn't need to accept pain. There was a solution. Doctors were put into this pressure cooker to, no matter what, make sure that there's no pain. And even worse, it eventually cycled into government, where we were expected every time that a patient had a visual analog score above 4 to drug them, to make sure they don't have pain. And I can tell you here in the Netherlands, because it's on the question that you asked, we saw this problem about 6 years ago. We did something about it, and we changed policy here in this country by saying we're not going to be scoring hospitals based on visual analog scores, but we're going to be scoring them based on how well organized their pain systems are organized. So I think there's various factors. I do agree that the marketing efforts have been the biggest problem, and I do blame these people for that. But at the same time, we also need to realize that society in general also needs to look at themselves and wonder why all this pressure is being put on the doctors to not accept certain things. And I also think the regulators need to adjust their systems and start scoring and adjust, regulating hospital systems in a different way. We're seeing in the Netherlands that because of this change that we do see that opiates are being used less. And we do this from GP care until the very top level of pain care. But what do you think about this?
I fully agree, and this is, there's a lot about this in the book. Just two quick thoughts. One, for those of you who may be less familiar, surely if you've been to the hospital at any point in recent years, and it may happen less here, it certainly happens in the States all the time, you'd have this experience where somebody would say, on a scale of 1 to 10, what's the pain that you're feeling? Or, from very unhappy face to very smiley face, where are you? And the idea was that pain would become a vital sign, that it was this like objective, measurable thing. Now, I think anybody who thinks about this for 2 seconds would realize that nothing is more subjective than the pain that you feel. My wife is much tougher than I am, and it's a long-running joke between us that, what for my wife is like a 3, for me is a 9. We go running together, and I say, my knee, and she says, my knee hurts too, but you don't see me stopping, and it's highly subjective, and yet this did become a kind of orthodoxy, and I agree there was pressure on physicians, there were pressures on hospitals, but to your point about it being society, I guess this is an example where you see the kind of perniciousness of these companies. Well, okay, so where do these regulations come from? From lobbying. Who was paying the lobbyists? Companies like Purdue. The idea that that you would start to, that you couldn't have anybody in pain and that doctors needed to start dosing people. It's this sort of strange thing, right? That the one of the weirdest aspects of this is that it was true that a lot of doctors did not receive training in pain or pain medicine, but all of the ideas and all of the education came from the pharma industry. And what the pharma industry was selling was, to use the tag phrase that they introduced with OxyContin, they said, remember I was talking earlier about how opioids used to be the thing on the top shelf. So what the actual marketing phrase for OxyContin was, it's the one to start with and the one to stay with. Which, if you're selling OxyContin, is a great tagline. But connected with that, they also didn't, what they taught people, I've talked to many doctors who've had this experience where they said, the pharma reps would come in and they would teach us how to get people on these drugs, but never how to get them off. And I've also talked to many people who've become addicted to opioids who say, I went in, I had an operation, the doctor wrote me a prescription for 30 days of OxyContin, started taking it. The problem was it wasn't working quite as long, so then I started taking more pills, and then I'm having more issues, and it starts to kind of cycle out of control. And I go back to the surgeon who wrote me the prescription, and I say, hey, doc, I'm feeling like there's a kind of undertow here and I'm getting sucked into something that's really uncomfortable. I don't know what to do. And the doctor says, whoa, I'm not an addiction specialist. And so I agree. I think that it's a kind of, there was huge failure across the board, but on the specific issue of the way in which there was pressure on hospital systems and so forth, I think if you dig deep enough, you'll find the influence of the pharma companies there as well.
Thanks. That was a great question. It was a long question, but it was a great question. Yeah.
I have a question about the FDA. As far as I know, it costs hundreds of millions, even billions of dollars to get a drug approved. And is the claim right, and what are the side effects? These are the main aspects. And I find it very difficult to that the side effect must have been observed while they do trials, that one person can sign off. I mean, it is extremely difficult. And even if it's signed off, and later on you see all the side effects, normally the FDA says, well, they will stop, they forbid you to sell the drug. So
why was it so easy?
I'm a bit puzzled by the role of the FDA in this whole story.
Yeah,
Being the Food and Drug Authority that approved the.
So a couple of things. Obviously it's not one person at the FDA, though there is, the chief medical examiner for the drug is the person who ultimately has the say. There were internal questions, and I have these emails where people would raise questions and say, I think this claim, there's literally an email where somebody says, I think the claim they're making about how it's less prone to abuse is BS. But part of the problem is there are clinical trials that are done, and then there are studies, right? And then the studies are reviewed, and there was a kind of intimacy in this particular process, an informality in the relationship between Curtis Wright, who was basically acting as kind of an in-house advocate, sometimes arguing against his colleagues at the FDA who were more skeptical. And in fact, there's this crazy incident in which we only learned this years later through litigation. Purdue sent 3 executives to go to, I think it was Maryland, where his office was, get a hotel room, and they spent 3 days in the hotel room helping him write his reviews of their studies. So it's like you go and help the teacher grade your test. It's an interesting one, right? Because I've talked to people at the FDA and I say, is that the way it works? And nobody will defend it today. But I wanted to find out more about that relationship and also more about when he started talking to them about a job. And so I filed a Freedom of Information Act request. And the FDA kind of blew me off, which is what usually happens with Freedom of Information Act requests. So I sued them in federal court. And I got a federal judge in New York to force the FDA to turn over thousands and thousands of pages of documents to me. And they started giving me all these documents, but I kept saying, I want the Curtis Wright stuff. I want to see his emails. I want to see what that guy was doing. And it took a while before I finally got my answer when they told me, we have nothing to give you from him because it's all been lost or destroyed. So I think something very untoward went on there. And I should say I called Curtis Wright. We had a conversation that lasted 7 seconds.
Was it good? It was short, but
It was a short. It was, yeah, exactly. Right. I'd sort of scarcely gotten the word out, but and to your answer to your question about the studies, there were some early studies actually that showed signs of withdrawal and other types of issues. One of the big ones was that the drug didn't actually last for 12 hours. That the marketing claim that it lasted for 12 hours was erroneous. But the FDA to this day claims that OxyContin works for 12 hours. It is simply a fact that in many, many cases it doesn't. It works for 8, and that actually is a recipe for addiction. If you have a drug that's on a 12-hour dosing cycle and it starts wearing off after 8, I, in my extensive back and forth with lawyers for the Sacklers, had this amazing thing exchanged just recently where I said, it only works for 8, and they said, no, it works for 12, always. And I said, but that's crazy. I mean, there's actually been a lot of written on this, and I've interviewed personally many, many people who said that it didn't last that long. I know that the company has talked about this internally as a problem. What makes you say it works for 12? And they said, well, because the FDA says that it works for 12. So I think it's quite an unholy relationship between the agency and the company, and pretty discouraging, to be honest with you.
Thank you. We have time for 2 or 3 questions. Yeah.
So thank you. I think you show very well the agency of the Sacklers is humongous. It's very strong. But my question would be, like, if you read a book like Deaths of Despair, it also indicates that at least part of the opioid crisis might be caused by a specific kind of pain in the American society. Any thoughts on that? Whether the Americans are actually in more pain than us Europeans?
I mean, that's a hard question. Personally, I'm a little bit skeptical of the idea that Americans have some special kind of pain that others don't. I will say we are the most over-medicated society in the world. We do everything in America is like de trop, It's just like everything is just sort of over the top, too much. There's more guns in America than there are people, right? I think all these things are kind of bound up, and so to look at the kind of the afflictions, to look at economic dislocation, to look at suicide rates and PTSD and the anxiety of the white working class and deindustrialization and like all of this other stuff. I mean, it's all there, but to me, that's not it's not a particularly satisfying account. I also think that I know this having read their emails, that for the Sacklers, like they will latch on to anything that's an alternative explanation for all the bad stuff that happened, one where they're not part of it. And I think there's a tendency, maybe especially in the United States, to talk about certain things. I mean, in a way, climate change is like this too. We have this tendency to talk about these totally man-made catastrophes as if they're acts of God, as if they're weather patterns, that they're sort of beyond our reckoning and they sweep in, and that no humans can be blamed. And I may just have too kind of prosecutorial a mindset, but I think that tends to let people off the hook when you talk about problems in that way. So I think Deaths of Despair is kind of an interesting idea from an academic point of view. I certainly wouldn't discount it as a factor. I think that all this stuff is complicated. But in a way, that's a harder diagnostic question. I'm dealing with a pretty easy question, which is crime and corruption on a very epic scale.
Thank you. More questions. Let's do 2 more. Yeah.
You didn't mention fentanyl yet, but you have a background in organized crime also with Mexican cartel. People in the United States say that opioids is being used to undermine American
Yeah, I should say I just have a master's in organized crime.
Right.
Background might be a little strong. So when we talk about the opioid crisis, I mean, this is, interestingly enough, this is another, to go to my point about reading the Sacklers' emails and seeing the stories they tell themselves. If we had a Sackler with us here tonight, they would be nodding their head very aggressively in answer to your question, and they would say, what we have today is a heroin and increasingly a fentanyl crisis. It's not an opioid crisis. Most of the overdoses that are happening are due to heroin and fentanyl, which are illegal drugs, which come from China and Mexico. China, Mexico. And the thing is, they're right if you take a snapshot of today. So prescription rates have gone down on OxyContin and other prescription opioids. Many of the pill mills of the sort you talked about have shut down. There's been a kind of tightening up of regulations. But what's interesting is to ask sort of how did we get here? And the truth is that the way the crisis unfolded is that you had initially OxyContin, then other prescription opioids, then people graduated to heroin, and then from heroin to fentanyl, or more often what happens is people buy what they think is heroin and it's laced with fentanyl. So it absolutely has evolved, and that's where we are today. And I don't mean to sound glib about China and Mexico. It is true that the drugs come into the country often from other places. It is true that there's big Chinese organized crime rackets involved in this, as when I started by talking about Mexico. I mean, if they think that the future is fentanyl, then they're going to move into fentanyl. That's what they do. But the tricky thing is when you look at the statistics about the number of people who start using heroin, who before that used prescription drugs. There's a guy that I interview at the end of the book. The book is actually largely not about drug users. It's more, I'm sort of quite closely focused on the Sacklers, but there's a guy who, as it happened, used to work on the property of Mortimer Sackler and was addicted to OxyContin. And I interviewed him, and he told me a story that I've heard from many other people, which is he said, I would never have thought I'd be somebody who would buy heroin on the street and stick a needle in my arm. My inhibition level was too high to do that. What I would do is take a prescription drug that I knew came out of a pill bottle and had been approved by the FDA. So I did that until I was really hooked. And then one day I was at my dealer who was going to sell me OxyContin because I couldn't get it with a prescription anymore. And he said, listen, I'm all out, but I'll sell you a bag of heroin for $10. And
which was cheaper than at the time then.
Yeah, than OxyContin, and much
OxyContin.
easier to get. And at that point, and then he said, and initially I told myself I would just snort the heroin, and then eventually he's shooting it up. So it's complicated. You're absolutely right. I mean, fentanyl's a huge issue. It's incredibly deadly. There's no way for people really to know often what they're getting. So even people who are quite experienced users can be surprised in deadly ways. But I wouldn't want the focus on heroin and fentanyl to sort of obviate the story of how we ended up here.
Okay. One more question. The last question is always the best question. Over there. Yeah.
No pressure.
No pressure. No pressure.
I'm a media lawyer. We represent journalists and whistleblowers. And I know it can be very tempting to be as a journalist, as an individual against big corporations. How do you deal personally with all those letters that arrive at your doorstep? You throw them away, you send them to your publisher. How do you deal with that?
And second, do you need a lawyer?
Yeah. Well, what I wanted to do is we have this downstairs bathroom, and we needed to wallpaper it. And I almost had enough, but my wife wouldn't let me. You get these letters when you do this work, and I've written about bad billionaires before, and it's kind of part of I'm afraid it's just part of the interaction.
They had you followed.
yeah, that was different. There was a point last summer when I was writing the book, and a neighbor came over and told us that there was a guy in an SUV had been watching our house all day. The guy subsequently came back. There's a funny thing where as a media lawyer, you'll appreciate this. Of course, I had to go for comment before putting this in the book, so I wrote to Purdue Pharma and said, do you have any knowledge of the guy who's been doing surveillance on my house in the suburbs of New York? And they wrote back and said, of course not, we would never do such a thing, that's outrageous. And then I wrote to a representative for the Sackler family and asked the same question, and there was no comment. I think you have to take these things seriously. I feel very lucky because I've been writing for the New Yorker for 15 years, and I have a wonderful lawyer there who's pretty fearless. And I've been working with my publisher Doubleday for about 15 years, and I have a lawyer there too who is ready to really go to bat for me. You take these things really seriously. When we first got that letter, the 17-page single-space letter I referred to, the opening salvo, it was making all these points about that article I'd written back in 2017. And the New Yorker actually engaged a fact checker to re-fact check the piece. It had been fact checked the first time. They checked it again, using as a roadmap that 17-page critique. And the fact checker, who's independent of me, came back and said, we're not going to change a word. This is all just bogus, all this stuff. This letter that they probably paid some lawyer $20,000 to write. And so I think you just kind of take it in stride. I don't throw it away. I read everything carefully, and I'll tell you, I mean, if somebody alerts me to a mistake in something I've written, then I will correct that mistake. I mean, I'm not infallible, and even billionaires, you don't want to write things about them that aren't true. But the fact that you can keep a lawyer on retainer who goes around firing off threats to people, to me, that's just not, it's not compelling. And I've gotten enough of these letters that I'm not as shaken or terrified. I don't mean to sound, to make myself sound tough, because I have the advantage that I have these great lawyers myself who I can call and who can advise me. But if you want to give me your card,
Thank you very much. I think I'll give the word back to Maarten, but not before we... No questions about Wind of Change, by the way. Do you want to whistle Wind of Change?
No, I'm not going to do it.
You have to either whistle Wind of Change or pronounce the Dutch title of
Oh, God. It's like damned if you do, damned if you don't. No,
Yes.
I whistled Wind of Change this afternoon, and I'm not a trained monkey.
Okay. Good answer. Patrick Radden Keefe.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hey, thank you so much.
Yeah? That was great. Thanks.
Likewise, thank you.
Thank you, Eelco, for moderating a wonderful conversation. Thank you, Patrick, for such great storytelling. You mentioned this afternoon that you read the audiobook. You read your book as an audiobook as well, and that it's selling very well. And I think we've heard tonight that I can understand why it's selling so well. Thank you. Thanks to Nieuw Amsterdam publishers for publishing this wonderful book. I just want to remind you that book signing will be outside at the book stand of Atheneum Boekhandel. We have a few upcoming events. The first one already this Sunday with a documentary called The Photograph, which is about the Harlem Renaissance, a film made by a Dutch filmmaker Sherman de Jesus, about the American photographer James Van der Zee. Sounds Dutch, but it's American. And then on October 27th, we'll have the New York Times journalist Cecilia Kang over. She will talk about her, we call it the Facebook book, An Ugly Truth, about the workings and dealings of Facebook. And there will be plenty more to come, of course, so please join us next time again. And for now, thank you both, and let's have a drink. Oh no, the bar is still not open. I don't know if the bar is open, actually, but if the bar is open, let's have a drink.